It's champion changes galore for 14.21 with over 30 different champions being adjusted. We'll have all this and much more in today's video as we provide you guys with a complete update to the solo queue tier list for every single role. And are you sick of losing games from bad teammates? Well, at SkillCapped, we turn your frustrating losses into satisfying wins. Take our brand new Season 14 courses that teach you the secrets to winning as top laner, jungler, mid laner, AD carry, and support. Then pair that with our other new courses on how to counter OP top and mid laners, master your jungle clears, or check out our new Bronze to Diamond series. We even have new Season 14 courses on macro, wave control, trading, settings and hotkeys, CSing, vision, mechanics, low elo mistakes, and the list goes on. Then head over to our Smurf commentaries. Simply select the champion you want to master and get guides from challenger experts teaching how to play your champion in the exact rank you're stuck in. You're even guaranteed to have all your questions answered by that very same challenger expert. Our service really does work. That's why we offer a rank up guarantee. If you don't rank up while actively using SkillCapped, you get your money back, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below right now to get the rank you've always dreamed of. Let's start the video off by covering all the item and rune changes, and first up, we've got a lethal tempo buff. Melee attack speed per stack is going up from 5 to 6%. There definitely aren't as many melee champs running lethal tempo right now as there are ranged champs, but a few who will look to benefit from this one the most are Master Yi, Trundle, Warwick, Yone, Yasuo, and Tryndamere. Blade of the Ruined King is getting hit with a nerf for this patch, as its current health on hit damage is being lowered from 10 to 8% for melee and from 6 to 5% for ranged. So even though Yasuo and Yone benefit from the lethal tempo buff, this blade nerf should even things out so that the champs aren't actually any better for next patch and could arguably be even worse if the blade nerf outweighs the lethal tempo buff. Irelia is going to be hurting from this nerf, but she is being directly buffed for this patch, so her power should remain pretty neutral. Kalista is going to become even weaker for solo queue, as she's been one of the worst ADCs as of recent and gets no compensation buff for this patch. Vayne, Warwick, Varus, Kog'Maw, Twitch, Briar, and Bel'Veth are a few other champs who primarily prioritize Blade as a core pickup, so they'll be knocked down in power. Mages and AP assassins are going to be losing a bit of burst damage with the magic pen on Sorc shoes dropping from 15 to 12. This change should give an indirect rise to lucidity boots for certain mages now, and we'll be keeping track of that throughout the patch. And the final system change of the patch is being issued to bounties. So minion and monster gold will now directly contribute to bounties instead of comparing to the average farm of the enemy team. On live right now, what could happen is that you could be farming very well and have the same amount of farm as your enemy laner, but if the enemy laner's teammates were not farming very well, you could then have a bounty on your head. With the new system, this should not happen anymore. Kill bounties will now be based on gold earned from kills or assists minus the gold given away from deaths instead of kill and death streaks. Right now on live servers, bounties are tied directly to how streaky you are, and once you die or get a kill on a streak, your bounty will reset. Bounties being based around streaks felt kinda bad in certain instances because let's say you were 0 and 5, but then you got 3 kills in a row. You could then be 3 and 5 with a bounty while the enemy would be 7 and 1, but if they just died recently, they'd no longer have a bounty for you to acquire. Now what will happen is, let's say you have 7 kills and just 1 death. Well, you're still going to be worth a good bounty even if you end up dying, since you have a lot more gold earned than given away. Of course, this will be way easier to grasp once we actually get to play with it on live servers, but hopefully we have helped to bring you in the general direction of what to expect. Alright, with all the system changes covered, now let's move on to looking at all the top lane champs who will be directly changed. Gangplank is first up, and the buffs are honestly quite underwhelming, as you're getting 0.5 added mana regen and E recharge time is dropping by 1 second. Not buffs that are going to suddenly turn Gangplank into a meta pick, so we'll be leaving him in the B tier for the time being. Irelia is getting directly buffed for 14.21, but remember, Blade of the Ruined King is getting nerfed, so these buffs likely don't end up being that impactful. Q mana cost is going down from 20 to 15. Q cooldown is being lowered by 1 second at all ranks. R will no longer reduce the cooldown of Irelia Q by 0.5, scaling to 1.5 seconds. Q damage total AD ratio is up from 60 to 70%. Q minion bonus damage is going down though, from 55 scaling to 265 to 50 scaling to 237. All in all, we don't see these buffs significantly outweighing the nerfs to Blade of the Ruined King, so we won't be moving Irelia anywhere on the top lane tier list, as she'll remain in the B tier. Kayle is going to receive a buff to her W mana cost, as it's being lowered from 90 scaling to 130 to 75 scaling to 115. Lethal tempo is also getting buffed, so pre-level 6, Kayle will have a little more added early game kill threat. We don't see these buffs being quite enough to propel Kayle up into an S tier position though, so she's going to continue to be placed in the A tier. A top lane champ who is most definitely not in need of a buff right now, being Malphite, is going to become tankier for this patch. Buff is quite small, but it's still a buff nonetheless, as Malphite's base health is being increased from 644 to 665. OP tier could be right around the corner for Malphite with any other positive change in the coming patches, but for now, we see him fitting in as one of the best S tier top laners. Teemo is going to become a little more evasive for this patch, with his W passive movement speed going up from 10 scaling to 26% to 12 scaling to 28%. W active movement speed is up as well, being increased from 20 scaling to 52% to 24 scaling to 56%. We really don't see it being enough to warrant a push up the tier list, so Teemo is going to remain in the B tier. Some of the biggest changes of the patch are going to be issued to Camille, as she's getting nerfed quite hard. Base health is dropping from 670 to 650. W damage is going down a significant amount, as it's being lowered by 20 damage at all ranks. E damage AD ratio will be dropping from 90 to 75%. R on hit damage will no longer have a base value, and instead only offer the percent current health damage. W damage nerf is the big one here, especially for more skilled Camille players who can utilize it consistently for poke early on in lane. Camille is just losing a good chunk of all-in power at level 6, with damage being reduced on 3 spells. We definitely don't expect for Camille to remain an OP tier champ anymore, and realistically see her falling down into the top lane A tier for 14.21. Gwen will be losing some damage on her passive for 14.21, as percent damage is being lowered from 0.72% per 100 AP to 0.6% per 100 AP. We're not super confident as to how impactful this nerf will actually land, so we're going to leave Gwen in the S tier for now, but if the nerf does end up landing more impactful, then we'll move her down the tier list for mid-patch. Nasus is next in line for a couple of nerfs, as his passive lifesteal is being lowered from 12 scaling to 24% to 9 scaling to 21%. Q base damage is being reduced by 5 at all ranks. Definitely going to be matchup dependent as to how impactful this nerf actually ends up being, as in more difficult lanes, less sustain is definitely going to feel worse than if you're in an easy matchup. Overall, we see Nasus losing a good amount of relative strength, so we'll be dropping him out of the OP tier and down into S. Volibear is going to be receiving a nerf to his E cooldown, as it's being increased from 12 to 14 seconds. Nerf like this does hurt his Rod of Ages into Flicker Blades build the most, because you're not actually able to acquire any ability haste at all from the setup. A bit of a hit to Volley's early game as well, since E is the spell that you take at level 1 and use it to help farm in more difficult matchups. Volley shouldn't lose too much power from this nerf. We only see him falling as far as A tier, which is where we'll be moving him for 14.21. As for the final top lane champ who's getting changed for this patch, we have Yorick. Passive base damage is going up from 2 scaling to 88 to 4 scaling to 90. The total AD ratio on passive is dropping though from 25 to 20%, and Riot has stated this will end up being about a 5% nerf in damage for Yorick. Yorick had just barely been holding on to an S tier position over the past patch, so we're going to be moving him into the A tier due to this nerf. So if we move on to the top lane tier list now, the OP tier will just feature one champion, being Shen. Shen gets the OP tier all for himself right now due to both Nasus and Camille being nerfed. One pretty underrated top lane champ to keep an eye on for 14.21 is Trundle. Trundle gets better for this patch due to the lethal tempo buffs, and he's been performing pretty well as of late. Warwick is another lethal tempo user who gets a bit better for 14.21, and he's also pretty undervalued as a top lane pick right now. Malphite and Shen are definitely going to be two of the most consistent top lane champs that you can play for this patch. Both champs can get really tanky, still deal a good amount of damage, and provide their team with incredibly strong teamfight tools. We had moved Mord down into the A tier for last patch due to him getting nerfed, but with so many top laners getting weaker for 14.21, Mord's relative power will be going back up, and he was on the fence of S tier last patch, so we're moving him back up. Elise has been a very dominant pick in the higher elos as of recent, so Riot's chopping off a bit of her scaling strength with armor growth going from 5.2 to 4.5. This is kind of just a nothing change, as Elise is an early to mid game reliant jungler, so nerfing her scaling doesn't really hurt her that much. As a result, we won't be moving Elise down the tier list due to this nerf, as she'll remain in the jungle S tier. Despite not being played that much in solo queue, Fiddlesticks has had one of the highest jungle win rates lately, so Riot will be nerfing him. Q current health damage is being lowered from 6 scaling to 10% to 5 scaling to 9%. We don't see this change being quite enough to remove Fiddle's S tier standing, so no movement on the tier list for him due to this change. Karthus is being targeted for 14.21 with his R AP ratio dropping from 75 to 70%. In the context of just hitting one champion with Karthus R, this change doesn't seem that impactful, but the fact that you're always hitting 5 champs with the spell is actually a more significant nerf than you'd expect. Karthus had been one of the more fringe S tier picks as of late, so with this nerf, we're going to be moving him into the A tier. Viego is going to be nerfed in the exact same way as Elise, with his armor growth going down from 5.2 to 4.6. We do see this nerf being a little more impactful for Viego compared to Elise, because he doesn't have that same kind of early game snowball strength that Elise does. If you can end game super quick, then a scaling nerf like this doesn't mean much, but it's a bit harder to stomp the early game with Viego. All in all, the nerf is still pretty light, and we don't see Viego Viego's power dropping too much, but we will be moving him from OP into S tier. So we have a look at the complete jungle tier list. OP tier is going to have a whole new look for 14.21. With Viego dropping down, we'll be promoting 3 champs up into the OP tier, as we've got Nocturne, Jarvan, and Kha'Zix leading the way. All 3 champs are great for solo queue right now, as we've seen so many junglers around them nerfed in the past few patches. We're going to be giving Udyr a bump back up into S tier for 14.21, as the build with Unending Despair and Spirit Visage is starting to catch on a lot more now, and is looking very powerful for the champ. Even though Master Yi is going to get a bit stronger early on due to the lethal tempo buffs, nerfs to Blade of the Ruined King should even things out power-wise, so we're not going to be moving Yi up the tier list for now. Warwick, on the other hand, could actually gain a bit of strength through this patch, just due to the fact that he doesn't build Blade of the Ruined King until his second item. For a good chunk of the early to mid game, your skirmish will now be stronger with Warwick due to the lethal tempo buff, so we could see him actually getting better for this patch despite the Blade nerf. Moving on to mid lane now, we've got a few champs on the buff list for this patch, starting with Azir. Azir's health regen is going up from 5 to 7. Base AD is getting a boost as well from 52 to 56. Pretty negligible nerfs for the most part when you consider Azir's current power level in 14.20. The buffs could lead to Azir moving into the mid lane B tier, but that's as far as we'd see things going. For now, we'll be leaving Azir in the mid lane C tier. These Corki buffs are pretty interesting because Riot continues to hammer away at buffing W damage. Base damage on W is going up by 50, while the bonus AD ratio is up from 150 to 200%. Does Riot want Corki using his W for wave clear now? That's kinda where we could see all this added damage on W being the most impactful, as it's not just a spell that you're looking to aggressively use for damage against champions 99% of the time. Maybe with W into Q, Corki can now easily chew through a minion wave, and he becomes this champ who can get early prio. The thing is though, Corki's early game skirmish is pretty weak, so even if the buff does allow him to push out waves better early on, he's not really able to do a whole lot with that priority. There are a few more changes as well, with passive damage going up from 15 to 20%. Our damage is getting a boost, being increased by 10 at all ranks, while the bonus AD ratio is up from 70 to 80%. So Corki has now been buffed multiple times over the past few patches, and these buffs are definitely the most impactful ones. With that being said, how much relative power he actually gains is still likely quite low, just due to how terrible of a spot he's been in for solo queue. Corki's win rate was around 44% in 14.20, so with these buffs we can probably expect in between a 2 to 4% spike. If the buffs land on the lower end, then Corki is still a C tier pick, but if they are on the more impactful side, he could get out of C tier jail and move into B. For now, we're going to leave Corki in the C tier, but if the buffs do land more significant, we'll shift him up for the mid-patch tier list. Qiyana has been one of the weakest assassins as of recent, so she's getting a buff for 14.21, with her W damage bonus AD ratio being increased from 10 to 20%. Health regen is getting a boost as well, going from 6 to 8. Considering how weak of a spot Qiyana has been in as of late, there's no way these buffs bring her power level up enough to warrant picking her over the majority of mids. Qiyana is going to remain placed in the mid lane B tier for 14.21. Talon's actually going to be getting a little more of a meaningful buff, as his W return base damage is going up by 10 at all ranks, while the bonus AD ratio is up from 80 to 90%. Qiyana's buff was only to her bonus AD ratio, while this one to Talon actually has his base damage going up. So for an assassin who wants to snowball early on, this early game buff should help out Talon more than Qiyana's buff will help her. As a result, we will be giving Talon a push up the tier list for this patch, moving him from B into A tier. Aurelion Sol has been one of the best mids as of late, so he's getting nerfed for this patch, with his base health dropping from 620 to 600. E damage AP ratio is going down as well, from 80 to 60%. Nothing too major here, as we still see Aurelion Sol being a very strong solo queue pick, but we're going to be dropping him out of the OP tier and moving him into S. Galio will be losing some base mana for this patch, as it's dropping from 500 to 410. Right now, the meta builds for Galio don't include any mana items at all, so with this change, we may see something like Rod of Ages rise in priority. Overall, it's a bit of a hit to the early laning of Galio, but if he does end up building something like Rod of Ages now post-Catalyst buy, the champ won't be any different really. Build priority may shift as a result of this change, but we don't see Galio losing much strength, so we'll be leaving him in the mid lane S tier. Hui has been one of the most OP mids as of recent, so he's getting tagged with a couple of nerfs. QQ damage AP ratio is being lowered from 75 to 70%. E cooldown is going up as well, from 12 scaling to 10 seconds to 13 scaling to 11 seconds. We see these nerfs hitting kind of similar to what we're expecting for Aurelion Sol. Not enough to actually reduce Hui's solo queue strength to where he's not worth playing, but enough to drop him out of the OP tier, so we're moving Hui into S. Kassadin is going to be losing some scaling strength for 14.21, with his Q and E losing damage. Q AP ratio is taking a hit, going from 70 to 60%, while EAP ratio is down from 70 to 65%. For a strong scaling champ like Kassadin, these nerfs will definitely be impactful, and we'll be moving the champ down the tier list, going from S into A tier. Yone is going to become quite a bit weaker for this patch, as he's E's hurting due to the Blade of the Ruined King nerfs and also being targeted with the direct nerf. To be fair, the direct nerf isn't all that meaningful as W max health damage is dropping by 1% at all ranks. Blade nerfs are definitely going to be the ones that hurt Yone the most, and as a result, we're moving the champ down the mid lane tier list, going from A into B tier. So having a look at the mid lane tier list now, OP tier gets a bit of a shuffle for 14.21 as we've now got Sylas joined by Ahri and Vex. Hwei and Aurelion Sol dropping down leaves room for Ahri and Vex to move up as they are the two mids who have been the closest to that OP tier spot in recent patches. Ahri is definitely the best mage that you can play for solo queue now, as Syndra was just recently nerfed due to the Ludens and Storm Surge changes, while Ahri runs Malignance into Horizon Focus, so she's actually gained a bunch of relative power when compared to Ludens and Storm Surge champs. Vex just continues to be a solo queue stomper due to the fact that she has so many favorable matchups into the most played mid laners in solo queue. With Yone and Yasuo getting even weaker for this patch due to the Blade of the Ruined King nerfs, it's even better for Vex, as those have been two of her better matchups. Heading down to the bot lane now, one champ we're actually very surprised is on the buff list for 14.21 is Nilah. Nilah had already seen a nice spike in power for 14.20 due to the collector buffs, and even though she was hotfix nerfed a bit, her power has remained quite high, which is why it's odd to see her buffed. How impactful these buffs actually land though is tough to say, because they are more quality of life changes than straight up numbers buffs. EQ damage projectile is being changed from a missile to instant. Q auto will remain empowered even if it times out mid-swing. Our attack lockout is going down from 1.1 to 1 second. So yeah, nothing too crazy here, but they are still buffs nonetheless, and with the likes of Kog'Maw getting weaker this patch due to the Blade of the Ruined King nerfs, we really think Nilah priority should be a lot higher. The champ may still be slept on for a bit, but definitely take advantage of her while you can, as we're moving Nilah up from S into OP tier. Sivir is the second ADC buff for this patch, as her base AD is going up from 58 to 60. Q damage is being changed as well, so that the base damage is up. However, the ratio is being changed from a total AD ratio to a bonus AD ratio. To make things easy to understand, Riot has stated that this change will be a buff for Sivir from levels 1 to 12. There's a chance Sivir moves up into A tier due to these buffs, but for now, we're going to be leaving her in B and we'll reassess if need be for mid-patch. Interesting to see Xayah buffed for this patch because she hasn't actually been the weakest ADC as of late. Buff is quite light with W bonus damage being increased from 20 to 25%. So no movement for Xayah on the tier list, as we can't see her becoming an S tier pick due to this buff, so she'll remain in the A tier. Kai'Sa is the lone ADC who will be nerfed for 14.21, as she's going to be losing damage on her passive. Passive first hit damage is going down by 1 at all ranks, and AP ratio drops from 15 to 12%. Passive stack base damage is also being lowered from 1 scaling to 12 to 1 scaling to 6, with the AP ratio going up from 2.5 to 3%. More of a later game nerf here to Kai'Sa, but she's not really an early game dominant pick anyways, so the change should hurt a decent amount. We're going to be dropping Kai'Sa out of the ADC S tier for this patch and moving her into A. So we have a new look to the ADC OP tier for this patch, as Kog'Maw is dropping out due to the Blade of the Ruined King nerf, and taking his spot will be Nilah. We may be a bit ambitious here moving Nilah into the OP tier, but with how everything is trending right now, she's set to be in a really great spot for this patch. The collector buffs from last patch were just so huge for her, and now the fact that we're seeing Kog, Twitch, Vayne, and Kalista all losing strength due to the Blade of the Ruined King nerfs, the relative power of Nilah only gets better for this patch. Kog'Maw, Twitch, and Kalista are all going to be dropping further down the tier list for 14.21, as they will be feeling the nerf to Blade. We're going to hold off on dropping Vayne for now because she has actually been performing pretty well recently, and we can still see her being a pretty good A tier pick. Tristana is one champ being pushed up the tier list for 14.21, as she's actually gotten better recently due to the collector buffs. Turns out the meta build for Trist right now has her rushing the collector, so with the item buff last patch, she's no longer one of the weakest ADCs. Swain is getting a massive overhaul for this patch, so let's break down all the changes that you should be most aware of. Base stats of Swain are being adjusted so that health regen is going up, however base mana is down and base mana regen is being increased. Passive healing is being changed in a bit of a weird way to where you'll now have more healing at certain levels but less healing at other levels. Q mana cost is being lowered by 5 at all ranks. The base damage on Q is being changed so that the max range Q damage is up, however the minimum range damage is down. W base damage is being lowered by 10 at all ranks. AP ratio on W is going up though from 55 to 60%. Slow on W is being increased from 25 to 50%. Slow duration is down though from 2.5 to 1.5 seconds, and reveal duration is now 6 seconds at all ranks instead of 4 scaling to 8 seconds. E is being changed so that the cooldown is increased from 10 flat to 14 scaling to 10 seconds. Mana cost is going up from 50 flat to 60 scaling to 80. E will no longer deal damage on the way out, however it will have its base damage increased from 35 scaling to 75 to 80 scaling to 240. AP ratio is going up by a ton from 25 to 60%. There are also some changes being issued to the missile width and missile speed of Swain E. For Swain's R, the cooldown is going up, however the cooldown will now start start on cast instead of post effect. Base damage on R is going down, however the base heal is being increased. Heal will now also have a 1.25% bonus health ratio. The recast portion of Swain's R is also being changed so that it now has an 8-second cooldown between recasts. Base damage is going up, but the AP ratio is being reduced. Slow on the recast of R is going up from 60 to 75%. Alright, those are all the changes, and with so many of them, it's pretty difficult to get a read on just how powerful Swain will be for this patch. For now, we're not going to be adjusting him anywhere on the tier list, but we'll circle back for mid-patch when we've seen him on live servers to give you guys a more accurate rating. Brand is actually going to be nerfed for 14.21, which is strange considering he's kind of fallen out of meta for mid and jungle while not being too powerful for support. Support is Brand's most popular role right now, but he's been pretty mediocre as of late, so nerfs don't make a ton of sense. Nevertheless, mana regen is dropping from 10.65 to 9. Passive detonation max health damage is being reduced by 1% at all ranks. Q mana cost is going up from 50 to 70, so actually some pretty solid nerfs here, and we'll be leaving Brand down in the support B tier for now. Senna will be losing a bit of durability for this patch, as her base armor and armor growth are both being reduced. Likely not the end of the world for Senna, especially considering how much of an outlier she's been in recent patches. There really hasn't been a better support than Senna, so even with these nerfs, she should still remain at the very least a competitive pick. We're going to be leaving Senna in the support OP tier for now, but if the changes do land a bit more impactful, then we'll adjust her further down the tier list for mid-patch. Bit of a random nerf here to Taric, who has always been a pretty high win rate champ for solo queue, but has never been nerfed because of that until now. W bonus armor is dropping from 9 scaling to 13% to 6 scaling to 10%. This nerf shouldn't be enough to lessen the power of Taric enough to where he drops down the tier list, so he'll remain in the S tier for 14.21. So if we have a look at the support tier list, OP tier will be looking the same as last patch with Senna and Lulu. Lulu is definitely looking to pull away even more as the highest priority solo queue support though, now that Senna has been nerfed. Other than Senna losing a bit of strength, there really isn't anything major going on for the role this patch, so expect the meta to stay very similar to where it was in 14.20. There are a good variety of supports to choose from right now. If you want to play a melee engaged support, then Poppy and Rel are very strong. For an enchanter, you've got Lulu leading the way. However, Janna is pretty underrated right now, while Nami and Melio are also quite strong. Even though Brand is nerfed for this patch, mages like Xerath and Vel'Koz are quite good right now, especially with how much Jhin is being played. Jhin play rate should spike even higher this patch due to Kai'Sa getting nerfed, so if you can play a good Xerath or Vel and pull them out with Jhin, the duo strength is incredible. Alright guys, one last thing, our rank up guarantee is insane. It's like signing up for the gym and getting a refund if you don't get ripped. That's how confident we are in SkillCapped. We obsess over making the best guides with top players, rigorous testing, and top tier video editing to make your climb easy. If you're ready to level up, visit SkillCapped.com and see the difference. So that is going to wrap everything up for our 14.21 tier list update. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.